If you enjoy listening to liberals cry, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you have seen the press releases and public statements by America's anti-gun movement, oh boy, are they upset and distressed about the huge victory for President Donald Trump, the next president of the United States, and of course the Republicans taking over the United States Senate. We're going to talk about why this is so important for our Second Amendment movement and why we can now go from playing defense to going on the offense. I'm going to give you a summary in this video, and we will be breaking down more details going forward, but you need to understand the big picture and why Trump's victory and the Republican victory in the United States Senate is so hugely important and great news for our right to keep and bear arms. We're going to talk all about it when we come right back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of Israel Disarmed, What the 10/7 Attacks Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so huge news. Obviously, you've already seen the news. Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. The Republicans have won the United States Senate, which is hugely important because it allows President Trump to get his cabinet picks through and, of course, to get his Supreme Court nominees through, as well as other federal judgeships. We'll talk about that in 1 second. This is a hugely favorable development for the Second Amendment for many reasons. But I just want to let you know how my night went. I was supposed to be on Fox News very, very late last night. But then, and I was hoping this happened, then, of course, the great news came in and it became part of a celebration. And if you're just going to Mar-a-Lago and you're going to West Palm Beach for the celebration, which I was extremely excited about, then there was no need for me to appear. So I'm glad that my appearance, which is what I was cheering for, usually I like to be on TV, but I was glad to be knocked off last night for a very good reason, and I could not be more excited to have been bumped for the celebratory win down there of Donald Trump and the Republicans in the U.S. Senate. Of course, the House is still too soon to call, but that's neither here nor there for the purposes of this video. Okay, so with that backdrop, let's talk about what we can expect for the Second Amendment movement. Big things and very favorable things. Let's start off with the United States Supreme Court. As you know from watching this channel, what's been going on for the last several years is since Bruin in June of 2022, the anti-gun movement has had a very clear strategy. And that is to do whatever they can to keep the lower courts involved with the Second Amendment cases and to prevent good Second Amendment cases from reaching the United States Supreme Court. And this was done not just by the anti-gun movement and by government lawyers. It was also done by really anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment judges who did whatever they could to delay the issuance of their decisions, to send things back for fact-finding that wasn't necessary to the district courts, and so on and so on. The only reason why that strategy conceivably was a good strategy for the anti-gun movement was because they concluded that the current composition of the United States Supreme Court was favorable to the right to keep and bear arms, and they wanted to deny that court the ability to issue more favorable rulings on the Second Amendment, which is one of the reasons why the only good case, or I shouldn't say good case, but the only case that they kind of pushed to the Supreme Court fast was the Rahimi case, because Zaki Rahimi's criminal record and factual background was so horrific that Merrick Garland and the Biden administration thought that they could get a bad precedent established against the Second Amendment, and that's why they pushed that case. But again, all the quote-unquote good Second Amendment cases that are favorable, like the Brian Range case involving a guy that lost his right to keep and bear arms for life because he had some misdemeanor conviction involving welfare fraud like 2 decades ago, those cases were delayed by, the Department of Justice and whatnot. Now, the reason why this election of Donald Trump with the Republican Senate is so huge is the reason why the anti-gunners thought their delay strategy could work is they were hoping that eventually Clarence Thomas or Justice Alito, or even Justice Roberts for that matter, would leave the Supreme Court and they would be replaced by a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris replacement along the lines of a Justice Brown Jackson, who's already gone on the record expressing concern, believe it or not, that the First Amendment right to free speech is unduly hindersome and burdensome on the ability of government to censor bad views. So with that said, now that Donald Trump has won with a Republican Senate, if Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito retire or leave the court for any reason, they're going to get replaced by a younger version of Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito. Now, there's a whole bunch of these judges that we're going to go through in a separate video, but it could be anybody from Judge Lawrence Van Dyke on the Ninth Circuit. It could be James Ho, who wrote the Rahimi decision in the Fifth Circuit. It could be Andy Oldman down there in the Fifth Circuit as well. These are extremely sharp, smart judges. It could be Amal Thapar, who, of course, is a judge on the Sixth Circuit, who actually has appeared on this show before in the Four Boxes Diner. The first time ever that a sitting federal judge actually appeared on the Second Amendment YouTube channel was Judge Amal Thapar, who, by the way, I'll be sitting on a panel with at the Federalist Society event in Washington, D.C. in about 10 days. We'll get to that in another video. So there's a lot of very good Second Amendment judges coming up through the pike that would be equally good, if not better, than Justice Alito and Justice Thomas. But again, it's not going to allow the anti-gunners with the Biden administration or Harris administration to flip those seats in favor of someone that's always going to rule in favor of gun control. So that delay tactic for the last several years since Broome was decided in 2022 has utterly failed the anti-gun movement. It was a right move at the time. It was the right strategy at the time, but it hasn't worked. And if you look at some of the comments made publicly by some of these anti-gun groups and gun control groups, you can see the depression oozing through their language, that they know that their court battles are going to go poorly in the future. Now, there's another thing. Now, I'm going to be a little speculative here. In addition to Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, there's two other older justices that we want to keep an eye on. One is Chief Justice John Roberts, who is now in his 70s. He conceivably could retire. Also, you have Justice Sotomayor, who is known for having particularly health problems. We wish her no ill will. We hope she's healthy and well and lives a long life. Of course, as humans, that's what we support, of course. But with that said, in the practical realities of the world, both Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Sotomayor both are potential candidates to leave the federal bench in the next couple of years, giving Donald Trump an opportunity to appoint younger conservative jurists in the mode of a Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito, or Justice Scalia, for that matter. Okay, with that said, this is very good news, because whatever's going to happen, we're not going to get terrible anti-gun judges out of a Trump administration, because it was the three Trump judges, the Gorsuch, the Barretts, and the Kavanaughs of the world that gave us, of course, the Bruin decision, and have been very good on gun issues so far, including overturning the Trump bump stock ruling, which we've talked about why that made strategic sense at the time, but let's not talk about spilled milk at this point, since we've knocked that out of law. So good news for the Supreme Court. It also, of course, will help the Second Amendment, because the more lower court judges on the district courts and the courts of appeals that are favorable to the notions of originalism, to the text of the Second Amendment, to the text of the Bill of Rights, the better it is for the Second Amendment movement, because we don't just want the Supreme Court to be very powerful and very good on the Second Amendment. We want the lower courts as well, because there's a lot of anti-gun judges that we want to switch out for judges that will actually respect the Constitution and respect the Second Amendment. And having Donald Trump appoint people like that with a Republican Senate in a position to confirm them, because as you know, federal judges, these are lifetime appointments, and because they're lifetime appointments, the president has to nominate the person, and then the U.S. Senate has to confirm the person. And since we control both, this is extremely good news for the federal judiciary, all the way up from the U.S. Supreme Court and all the way down to the inferior district courts, for example. So fantastic news. Also on the Supreme Court issue, I'm going to be a little speculative here. I would bet, I don't want to say my bottom dollar, but I would bet a lot of money that just at a minimum, Justice Sam Alito is going to retire in June. I think the word on the street in Washington and around the courts is that Justice Alito has been interested in retiring for some time. Obviously, I don't think he wanted to do it with the Democrats in power for a bunch of reasons. And now, of course, he's going to be able to retire. So I think the odds of Justice Alito retiring sometime between now and June is extremely high. So what I'm hoping happens is that Justice Alito and Justice Thomas are looking at the Snope case, which is going to be conferenced for the first time in mid-December, and then that'll get relisted presumably to January, with a final decision on the cert petition in January. What I'm hoping happens is that Justice Alito and Justice Thomas sit down and say, we don't want to leave this Supreme Court until we resolve this extremely easy case of protecting semi-automatic rifles that are obviously in common use by Americans for lawful purposes. There's tens of millions of these. Some of these justices probably even own these things. It's my guess. And with that said, I would think that both Justice Thomas and Justice Alito would like to resolve this before they leave the court. By my counting of the noses, I think you've got those two votes. You got Gorsuch and you got Kavanaugh, who actually wrote the powerful decision in the Heller 2 case in dissent, saying that semi-automatic rifle bans by the District of Columbia were unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. That was in the year of our Lord 2011 that then Judge Brett Kavanaugh wrote that decision, and now he's a justice. So I think this is a slam dunk case if we can get the Supreme Court to grant cert. And I think the fact that we now have a Republican in the White House and Republicans in the Senate is going to incentivize Justice Alito and Justice Thomas to talk to the other justices and say, look, we want to get this cleaned up once and for all before we leave the bench. That's what I'm hoping happens. Only time will tell. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that's what the courts are looking like. Very good news all across the board. We'll do a separate video on who I think are potential Supreme Court justices in the future, but that will be the purposes of a separate video. Now, let's move on to the next issue, the ATF. The ATF. Now, okay, we're going to do some videos about whether or not we actually want to abolish the ATF. There's some strategic considerations with the good and the bad and the ugly of abolishing the ATF. Now, obviously, overall, I would like to get rid of the ATF completely, okay? That's my instinct. That's where I would like to go. But I'm also a realist, and I know that that may not be possible. And there may be some arguments against getting rid of the ATF for reasons we can talk about in a separate video. But whatever it is, whatever you think about that particular issue of getting rid of the ATF, certainly there's opportunities to defund the ATF, to cut their budget in half, to cut the number of employees in half. I might even ship them off to Alaska. If I ran the ATF and I could control it and I had to keep them alive and well, I might even move the ATF headquarters to like Alaska. That might be kind of fun. But again, I don't know how much of that is doable right here and right now. But what is doable with the ATF is the following. There is no doubt that all the executive orders and regulations that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris put into place, expanding the scope of authority of the ATF, including the quote-unquote ghost gun rule dealing with unserialized firearms and weapons parts kits that we saw litigated in the U.S. Supreme Court in Vanderstock. No decision on that yet. Those can all be unwound by Donald Trump executive orders and Donald Trump regulations. And at a minimum, every regulation put in place by the Biden administration touching on guns should be unwound and vacated and undone. At a minimum, that's the first thing that should occur. And then, of course, there are other possibilities to improve regulations in a way to make it more favorable to FFLs and other people in the gun space. Again, we'll do the details in a separate video on that, but at a minimum, everything that Joe Biden did with the ATF should be unwound. Relatedly, we now know that the White House under Joe Biden created that Office of Gun Violence Policy or Office of Gun whatever it was. I think it's the White House Office on Gun Violence Policy, something like that. Obviously, to the extent that's going to continue to exist, that needs to essentially be converted into an office of the Second Amendment and used offensively to advance the right to keep and bear arms, if that office is even going to continue to exist, or it could just be disbanded and tossed into the trash bin in history. But again, whatever it is, whoever's there, it's not going to be the same people. So that's key, because personnel is policy. You got to get the right people in there, of course. And we want people in there that support the Second Amendment. So that's what you would deal with the ATF. That's the dealing with the White House Office of Gun Violence Policy or whatever that nonsense is that Joe Biden created, that Kamala Harris ran. But let's move on to the next thing, which is the Department of Justice. Okay, firing Merrick Garland, in addition to Jack Smith, by the way, is a no-brainer. This is also very good news because Elizabeth Proligar, who you've heard a lot about, who is the Solicitor General of the United States, and you've heard her argue a bunch of cases involving the ATF and the like. You've heard her, you've listened to her, a lot of you complained about her. It's very good that Trump won because I think she might have been the next Supreme Court justice. That's not going to happen, thank God, because she's very smart and would be very good for the other side on the Supreme Court, and we would not want that. So obviously Merrick Garland, as the Attorney General of the United States, is going to get thrown aside. He's going to be bye-bye. Elizabeth Proligar, the Solicitor General, picked by Joe Biden, is going to go bye-bye, and this is great news. It's going to give us an opportunity to put in a strong Attorney General that supports the Second Amendment and, just as importantly for our purposes, a Solicitor General. Now, the one thing that I'm going to want to hear out of a potential Attorney General slot or a Solicitor General slot is, are they willing, and listen carefully, I'm going to get a little geeky here, are they willing to confess error on behalf of the federal government in cases where the federal government believes that the courts have unduly violated the right to keep and bear arms. There are opportunities for the Biden, well, basically, if the Biden administration has been taking certain positions on behalf of the DOJ against the Second Amendment, and there's a new Department of Justice personnel comes in, new Attorney General, new Solicitor General. Remember, the Solicitor General is the person that argues on behalf of the federal government in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Attorney General is the overall head of the entire Department of Justice. So the Solicitor General is usually picked by the Attorney General of the United States and then confirmed by the, he's technically the Solicitor General is nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but the Solicitor General is usually picked, internally at least, by the person that the President selects to be the Attorney General. So whoever becomes the Attorney General of the United States under Donald Trump will have the power to be heavily important in selecting the Solicitor General to argue cases on behalf of the Department of Justice in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So those are two important slots. Obviously, whoever is picked will be a lot better on guns no matter what than the two current people there. And this is certainly going to be an issue that a lot of people are going to be looking at because the Second Amendment is a huge deal. And don't just believe me. Remember, Elon Musk, the richest man in the world who runs X, is heavily involved with the new Trump administration. We all know this. And Elon Musk is hugely pro-Second Amendment to the point where there's only two things you had to sign off on when you signed the America PAC Elon Musk petition. And that was that you supported the right to free speech under the First Amendment and you supported the right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment. And that was how important this issue is to Elon Musk. So I'm sure that whoever is selected to be the Attorney General or the Solicitor General is going to have a similar vision of the right to keep and bear arms that we have on this channel. All right, so there you have it. So that's kind of the big picture. The U.S. Supreme Court, who's the Attorney General, who is the Solicitor General, what's going to go on with the lower courts, the future of the ATF, the future of the Department of Justice, the future of the Solicitor General's office before the Supreme Court. These are all the things that we're going to be looking at, and we are 1,000 times better off today than we were last week on all of these issues and all these people moving forward. We just have to get to the point where Donald Trump is actually sworn in a couple months, so we just got to get through this process here so there's no dramatic changes or changes in the Supreme Court between now and then. That's what we should be concerned about. Assuming that doesn't happen, it's going to be, I don't want to say smooth sailing, that's not accurate, but it's going to be a heck of a lot better because we're not going to be playing defense. And as to those state court laws that have been enacted in places like Colorado and other places, those are going to be ripe for the picking now that they're eventually going to have to go before the current Supreme Court composition, and the delays that we've been seeing are not going to matter anymore because the delays will no longer advance the agenda of the anti-gun movement because it's just going to delay the inevitable. It's not going to change anything with the composition of the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court composition is not going to change, and if it does change, it will probably be changed to the right, or it will just be more of the same with a younger version of a Justice Alito or a younger version of Clarence Thomas. They're fantastic justices, but there are other people out there that will be equally, if not better, on a lot of our Second Amendment related issues. All right, folks, so great news. Very excited. We'll keep you informed as the things progress, and make sure you follow me on X at @4boxofdiner where there's even more Second Amendment information. Don't forget to like this video and share it, and make sure you subscribe to this channel. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers as best as we can. We're working hard, and we'll see you again very soon, I hope, here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.